One of these made him leave the theater before it finished because he was too frightened to keep watching. One gave him nightmares for weeks and changed what he thought horror could accomplish. And one he refused to watch alone, even though he was already a best-selling horror author when it was released. Number 8. The Changeling, 1980.
One of them is John Russell, composer, professor. The other...
Peter Medak directed this one for Chessman Park Productions with a budget of approximately $7.5 million and delivered what Stephen King has called the finest traditional ghost story ever committed to film. A movie that understands the difference between horror that shocks and horror that genuinely unsettles, that builds dread through atmosphere and implication, rather than through spectacle. George C. Scott plays John Russell, a composer who moves into a Seattle mansion after his wife and daughter are killed in a traffic accident and discovers the house is haunted by the ghost of a murdered child. The film is structured as both ghost story and mystery, and Medak handles both elements with a patience and a formal discipline that most horror directors never attempt. What makes The Changeling genuinely frightening, rather than merely spooky, is Medak's commitment to treating the supernatural events as genuinely threatening, rather than as opportunities for jump scares or visual effects showcases. The seance sequence, in which the ghost communicates through automatic writing and reveals what happened to him, is shot with such restraint and such attention to the physical reality of the medium's hand moving across the paper that it becomes genuinely eerie despite containing no conventional horror imagery. The ball bouncing down the stairs, which should be a cliché, becomes terrifying through repetition and through Scott's performance of accumulating dread. That Scott gives one of his finest performances, playing Russell as a man whose grief has left him emotionally numb and who consequently approaches the haunting with a rationality that gradually breaks down as the evidence becomes undeniable. He is not a believer looking for confirmation. He is a skeptic being systematically stripped of his skepticism by events that cannot be explained away. That progression from doubt to terrified acceptance is what makes the film work on a level beyond simple ghost story mechanics. The production design by Trevor Williams creates a mansion that feels genuinely haunted without relying on gothic excess. The house is large and old and full of unused rooms, but it is not decrepit. It is simply a place where something terrible happened long ago, and that terrible thing has never left. The cinematography by John Coquillon uses natural light wherever possible and avoids the crutch of darkness to hide cheap effects. Most of the frightening sequences happen in daylight or in well-lit interiors, which makes them more rather than less effective because there is nowhere to hide from what is happening. King has talked extensively about The Changeling in interviews and in his non-fiction book Danse Macabre, where he analyzes it as an example of how to construct horror through patient accumulation of detail rather than through shock tactics. He has said that the wheelchair sequence, in which Russell investigates the attic and finds a child's wheelchair that begins moving on its own, frightened him more than most slasher films because the wheelchair is presented as fact rather than as hallucination, because Medak shoots it in a way that gives it physical weight and genuine menace. The film was not a significant commercial success on initial release, grossing approximately $11 million domestically, which against production and marketing costs was barely profitable. Critical reception was mixed, with some reviewers praising the atmosphere and Scott's performance, while others found it slow and old-fashioned, compared to the slasher films dominating horror at the time. But it built a devoted following through home video and cable television, where its patient approach to horror found an audience willing to engage with something more subtle than Friday the 13th. King adapted some of the film's techniques in his own work, particularly in his novels that deal with haunted locations like The Shining and Bag of Bones. The idea that a house can contain trauma, that violence leaves a permanent mark on physical space, is central to much of King's horror fiction. And The Changeling provided a cinematic template for how that idea could be depicted. He has recommended it repeatedly to readers and filmmakers, calling it essential viewing for understanding how restraint and patience can generate more genuine fear than gore and shock. The film exists in multiple cuts with slight variations, but the differences are minor. The version most widely available is Medac's preferred cut, which runs approximately 100 minutes. Russell Lane's score, used sparingly, enhances rather than dictates the atmosphere. The Changeling is the rare horror film that improves with age, that becomes more rather than less effective, as audiences become more sophisticated about genre conventions, because it is built on fundamentals that never become dated. For King, this is the gold standard of the ghost story film, the one against which all others must be measured. Number 7. The Blair Witch Project, 1999.
I can see you.
I'm real excited about this. Thank you for
I'm
the
very
opportunity.
glad.
Daniel Myrick and Eduardo Sanchez made this one for Haxan Films with a budget of approximately $60,000, shot over 8 days using handheld cameras and improvising most of the dialogue with 3 actors who were given only basic plot guidelines and genuine stress conditions, and created what King has called the most viscerally frightening found footage film ever made and one of the most important horror innovations of the past 30 years. The premise is deceptively simple. 3 student filmmakers hike into Maryland woods to investigate the legend of the Blair Witch and disappear. A year later, their footage is found. The film is that footage. What makes the Blair Witch Project genuinely terrifying is its commitment to presenting everything as documentary fact, to never breaking the illusion that what you are watching is real recovered footage of real events. The directors shot with consumer-grade video cameras. They had the actors carry the equipment and shoot everything themselves. They gave them less food each day to make their exhaustion and irritability genuine. They created sounds and disturbances in the night that the actors experienced as real threats because they did not know what was staged and what was environmental. The terror you see on screen is substantially real, even if the source of that terror was the directors rather than a supernatural entity. Heather Donahue, Joshua Leonard, and Michael C. Williams give performances that feel completely authentic because they are substantially authentic. The breakdown of the group dynamic, the escalating panic, the moments of genuine fear when they hear things in the darkness, all of it is performed. But the emotional reality underneath the performance is genuine. The famous scene in which Donahue apologizes to the camera, her face lit from below by the camera's light, snot running from her nose, eyes red from crying, is one of the most disturbing pieces of acting in horror cinema, precisely because it does not feel like acting. The film's marketing was as important as the film itself in creating its effectiveness. Artisan Entertainment launched a website suggesting the events were real, that the filmmakers had genuinely disappeared, that the footage had been recovered by authorities. Missing persons posters appeared on college campuses. The IMDb listed the 3 actors as missing, presumed dead. By the time the film opened, a substantial portion of the audience believed they were watching actual documentary footage of murders. Even audiences who knew it was fiction found the verisimilitude disorienting. King saw it at a press screening before the marketing campaign had built to full saturation, and has said he found it genuinely difficult to watch, that the handheld camera work and the actors' distress created a physical discomfort that most horror films never approach. He compared it to watching found footage of actual disasters, something that induces a specific type of dread that fictional horror rarely achieves. The ending, in which Heather enters the basement and finds Joshua facing the corner, and then the camera drops and everything goes silent, is for King one of the most effective horror conclusions ever filmed because it refuses to show what happens and forces the audience to imagine it. The film grossed over $240 million worldwide against its $60,000 budget, making it one of the most profitable films ever made relative to its cost. That success generated a wave of found footage horror that continues today, but King has argued that most subsequent films in that mode missed the point of what Myrick and Sanchez achieved. The Blair Witch Project works because the lo-fi aesthetic serves the story, rather than being the story. Because the filmmakers understood that suggestion is more powerful than depiction, and because they were willing to subject their actors to genuine discomfort to achieve genuine performances of fear. King has cited the Blair Witch Project as evidence that horror does not require budget or effects or gore to be effective, that the most frightening thing cinema can show is human beings in genuine distress reacting to threats they cannot see or understand. The influence on his own later work is visible in novels like Cell and Under the Dome, where the emphasis shifts from describing the horror directly to depicting people's reactions to the horror and letting those reactions generate the fear. He has called it essential viewing for anyone interested in how horror operates at the most fundamental level, stripped of every convention except the basic human fear of being lost and hunted in the dark. Number 6. Night of the Living Dead, 1968.
They ought to make the day the time changes, the first day of summer.
What?
Well, it's 8 o'clock and it's still light.
George A. Romero made this one in Pittsburgh for Image 10 Productions, with a budget of approximately $114,000 raised from local investors. Shot on black and white 16mm film that was blown up to 35mm for theatrical release, and created what King has called the most influential horror film ever made and one of the most genuinely disturbing experiences cinema has ever produced. The premise established the template every zombie story since has followed. The dead are returning to life and eating the living. A group of people barricade themselves in a farmhouse and attempt to survive. The zombies are not the only threat. The people inside turn on each other. Nobody survives intact. What makes Night of the Living Dead genuinely terrifying, rather than simply graphic, is Romero's decision to treat the premise with complete seriousness, to shoot it with a documentary starkness that strips away the comfortable distance between audience and event. The black and white cinematography by Romero himself creates a newsreel quality that makes everything feel captured rather than staged. The performances are naturalistic rather than theatrical. The zombies move slowly and clumsily, like actual corpses reanimated rather than like athletes in makeup. And the violence when it arrives is staged with a brutality that mainstream horror in 1968 simply did not show. Dwayne Jones plays Ben, the protagonist, in a casting decision that was racially groundbreaking for its time, and that Romero insisted was based purely on Jones being the best actor who auditioned. The film never comments explicitly on Ben's race, but it is impossible to watch his treatment by the other characters, particularly Harry Cooper, played by Carl Hardman, without understanding that racial tension is part of what destroys the group's cohesion. The ending, in which Ben survives the night only to be shot by a redneck posse who mistake him for a zombie, is one of the most devastating conclusions in American cinema, and one that resonates entirely differently when you understand it was released in 1968. The same year Martin Luther King was assassinated. King has written extensively about Night of the Living Dead in Danse Macabre and in numerous interviews, calling it the film that changed his understanding of what horror could accomplish. He saw it at a Saturday matinee with an audience full of children, expecting a conventional monster movie, and watched as the film systematically traumatized them, as parents started taking their crying children out of the theater, as what should have been an afternoon's entertainment became something genuinely upsetting. That experience convinced King that horror had power beyond simple shock, that it could genuinely disturb, and that disturbance had value. The film's production history is the stuff of independent filmmaking legend. Romero and his collaborators were Pittsburgh commercial and industrial filmmakers who decided to make a feature film. They shot on weekends and evenings. They used real locations. They created gore effects using chocolate syrup and animal organs from a local butcher. The farmhouse was a real farmhouse they rented. The cemetery was a real cemetery. The realism of the locations contributes substantially to the film's effectiveness because nothing feels like a set. The film made approximately $30 million in its initial theatrical run, which on its tiny budget was extraordinary. But it also generated serious controversy. The MMPAA had not yet instituted its rating system, and the film was released unrated to theaters that had no way to prevent children from attending. The resulting outcry about children being exposed to graphic violence contributed to the creation of the modern rating system. Critics were divided between those who recognized Romero's achievement and those who found it repulsive and irresponsible. King has defended it consistently, arguing that Night of the Living Dead is not exploitative but genuinely serious. That Romero's nihilistic vision of human beings failing to cooperate, even when cooperation is their only chance for survival, is a legitimate and important horror. The film's influence on King's own work is unmistakable. The siege narrative of Cujo, the social collapse of The Stand, the claustrophobic group dynamics of The Mist, all draw directly from what Romero pioneered. For King, this is the horror film that demonstrated the genre could be genuinely important, genuinely disturbing, and genuinely artful simultaneously. Number 5. The Exorcist, 1973.
Well, you used to really be scared here.
Johnny!
William Friedkin directed this one for Warner Brothers based on William Peter Blatty's novel with a budget of approximately $12 million and delivered what Stephen King has called the most frightening film ever made. Full stop. No qualifiers, no genre distinctions. The film follows the possession of 12-year-old Regan McNeil and the attempts by two priests to exorcise the demon controlling her. The premise is straightforward. What Friedkin did with that premise was create something so viscerally upsetting that audience members fainted, vomited, and in documented cases required medical attention during theatrical screenings. King saw it on opening weekend and has said he has never been more frightened in the cinema before or since. Ellen Burstyn plays Chris McNeil, Regan's mother, an actress who watches helplessly as her daughter transforms into something unrecognizable. Linda Blair plays Regan with a combination of innocence in the early scenes and genuine menace in the possession sequences that is extraordinary work for a 14-year-old performer. Max von Sydow plays Father Marin, the elderly priest with experience fighting this particular demon. Jason Miller plays Father Kairos, the younger priest whose crisis of faith becomes central to the film's spiritual dimension. And Mercedes McCambridge provides the demon's voice with a performance so disturbing that it cannot be separated from the film's effectiveness. What makes The Exorcist genuinely terrifying is Friedkin's commitment to treating the possession as absolutely real within the film's reality, to never winking at the audience or providing comfortable distance from what is happening to this child. The medical sequences, in which Regan undergoes invasive testing to rule out physical causes for her symptoms, are shot with the same unflinching attention as the supernatural sequences. The possession effects, achieved through practical makeup, puppetry, and Mercedes McCambridge's voice work, are presented matter-of-factly rather than being staged for maximum shock. And the result is something that feels genuinely evil rather than simply scary. The scenes of Regan possessed are genuinely difficult to watch. The obscenity, the physical contortions, the violence she inflicts on herself and others, all of it is staged with an intensity that pushes well beyond what horror films typically attempt. The spider walk sequence, which was cut from the original theatrical release and restored in the 2000s, remains one of the most disturbing images in horror cinema. The crucifix scene generated walkouts and continues to be almost unwatchable. Friedkin was not interested in making audiences comfortable. He was interested in depicting genuine spiritual warfare. King has talked extensively about The Exorcist's impact on him, both as a viewer and as a writer. He saw it 3 times in theaters, despite finding it genuinely upsetting, because he wanted to understand how Friedkin had achieved what he achieved. He has said the film taught him that horror could address genuine religious questions, that the battle between good and evil could be depicted literally rather than metaphorically, and that audiences were willing to engage with material that genuinely disturbed them if the craft was sufficient. The film grossed over $400 million worldwide and became a genuine cultural phenomenon. It received 10 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture, and won 2 for Adapted Screenplay and Sound. Critical reception was overwhelmingly positive, with some dissenters who found it exploitative or offensive. The controversy only increased its commercial appeal. Lines wrapped around blocks. Theatrical runs extended for months. The film became an event that people felt they had to experience, regardless of whether they typically enjoyed horror. The influence on King's work is direct and acknowledged. His novel, Salem's Lot, uses many of the same techniques, treating supernatural evil as genuine theological threat rather than as metaphor. Revival, published in 2014, is his most sustained engagement with the same spiritual questions The Exorcist raises. He has called it the finest religious horror film ever made, an essential viewing for understanding what horror is capable of achieving when it engages seriously with questions of faith, doubt, and the existence of genuine evil. For King, The Exorcist is not simply the scariest film ever made. It is one of the most important films ever made in any genre. Number 4. Don't Look Now, 1973.
I can see you.
I'm real excited about this. Thank you for
I'm
the
very
opportunity.
glad.
Nicholas Roeg directed this one for British Lion Films and Casey Productions with a budget of approximately $1.5 million and delivered what Stephen King has called the most psychologically sophisticated horror film ever made. A movie that operates less through conventional scares and more through sustained atmosphere of dread and grief that builds toward one of the most shocking endings in the history of the genre. Donald Sutherland and Julie Christie play John and Laura Baxter, a couple in Venice following the drowning death of their young daughter. John is overseeing church restoration. Laura encounters two elderly sisters, one claiming psychic ability, who says she has contacted their daughter. John begins seeing a small figure in a red coat moving through the foggy Venetian streets. What makes Don't Look Now genuinely frightening is Roeg's refusal to provide comfortable genre boundaries. The film is simultaneously a ghost story, a psychological drama about grief, and a thriller about a man pursued through a labyrinthine city by something he cannot identify. Roeg's editing moves fluidly between past, present, and flashes of future with a disorienting effect that mirrors John's fragmenting psychological state. The Venice locations, shot in winter fog and filmed with a coldness that strips the city of tourist romance, becomes a maze of dead ends and dark water. King has talked about the ending, which he refuses to spoil in interviews, but which he says frightened him more profoundly than most conventional horror because it recontextualizes everything that preceded it in a single image. The reveal of what John has actually been following through Venice is one of those rare moments where a film achieves genuine shock through implication and visual juxtaposition, rather than through gore or jump scares. The film was not a significant commercial success on release, making approximately $5 million worldwide. Critical reception was divided, with some recognizing Roeg's achievement and others finding it too oblique and too cold. Its reputation has grown substantially, and it now appears regularly on lists of the greatest horror films. The influence on King's work is visible in stories that use grief as a doorway to horror, particularly Pet Sematary, where a father's inability to accept his child's death leads him into genuine evil. King has called it essential viewing for understanding how horror can operate through accumulation of unease rather than through conventional scare tactics, and how the most frightening thing cinema can depict is not monsters, but the moment when reality reveals itself to be something other than what you believed it was. Number 3. Rosemary's Baby, 1968.
Children?
We planned to.
Roman Polanski directed this one for Paramount Pictures, based on Ira Levin's novel, with a budget of approximately $3.5 million, and delivered what Stephen King has called the most perfectly constructed horror film ever made. A movie where every element from casting to production design to sound design works in complete harmony to create sustained paranoia that becomes unbearable long before the supernatural element is confirmed. Mia Farrow plays Rosemary Woodhouse, a young woman who moves into a New York apartment building with her actor husband and becomes pregnant under circumstances that she gradually comes to understand are part of a satanic conspiracy. What makes Rosemary's Baby genuinely terrifying is Polanski's commitment to keeping the audience locked into Rosemary's perspective, to never confirming whether what she fears is real or whether she is experiencing a psychological breakdown. The film operates as both supernatural horror and as a portrait of gaslighting, of a woman being systematically isolated and convinced that her perceptions are unreliable. Every reassurance she receives from her husband, from her neighbors, from her doctor, serves to deepen her paranoia rather than relieve it. Ruth Gordon and Sidney Blackmer play the elderly neighbors with performances of such sustained ambiguity that they remain genuinely unsettling, even when they are simply being friendly. John Cassavetes plays Rosemary's husband Gizius with a casual selfishness that makes his betrayal completely believable. The supporting cast creates a closed world where everyone Rosemary encounters is potentially part of the conspiracy or potentially innocent and concerned, and the film never releases that tension until the ending confirms her worst fears. King has written extensively about Rosemary's Baby and Danse Macabre, analyzing it as the template for domestic horror, for stories where the threat comes not from outside, but from the people closest to you. The film's influence on his work is direct. The paranoia of The Shining, the isolation of Misery, the conspiracy elements of Revival all draw from what Polanski pioneered here. The film was a massive commercial success, grossing over $33 million domestically, and received widespread critical acclaim. Polanski's later criminal conviction has complicated engagement with his work, but King has maintained that Rosemary's Baby remains one of the supreme achievements in horror filmmaking regardless of its creator's actions. The craft is undeniable, the influence is permanent. For King, this is the gold standard of how to build horror through accumulation of detail and sustained paranoia. Number 2. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. Tobe Hooper made this one in Texas for Vortex Productions, with a budget of approximately $140,000 raised from local investors. Shot during the summer heat, with a cast and crew working under genuinely punishing conditions, and created what Stephen King has called the most purely visceral horror film ever made, a movie that operates less through conventional narrative and more through sustained assault on the senses. The film follows 5 young people who stop at a remote Texas farmhouse and encounter a family of unemployed slaughterhouse workers who have continued practicing their professional skills on human subjects. Leatherface, wearing a mask made of human skin and wielding a chainsaw, became instantly iconic despite minimal screen time. What makes the Texas Chainsaw Massacre genuinely terrifying is Hooper's commitment to creating an atmosphere of complete dread through environmental detail rather than through graphic violence. The film has almost no explicit gore. The horror comes from the heat visible on screen, from the sweat and the exhaustion and the genuine distress of performers working in 100-degree temperatures, from the production design that fills the farmhouse with bones and decomposing furniture, and the specific texture of rural poverty and isolation. The dinner table sequence, filmed over 27 continuous hours, captures genuine hysteria from actress Marilyn Burns, because by that point in production, the line between performance and actual trauma had essentially dissolved. King saw it at a drive-in shortly after release and has described being genuinely shaken, not because of graphic content, but because of the film's commitment to making violence feel absolutely real rather than choreographed or stylized. The chainsaw sequences are frightening, not because they show dismemberment, but because the sound design and the camera work create complete sensory chaos. You cannot see clearly what is happening. You can only hear the chainsaw and see Leatherface moving and understand that something terrible is occurring just outside the frame. The film was made for essentially nothing and grossed over $30 million in its initial release, becoming one of the most profitable independent films ever made. It was also banned in numerous countries, refused classification in others, and generated sustained controversy about screen violence that continued for years. King has defended it consistently, arguing that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is not exploitative but genuinely nihilistic, a film about the collapse of American pastoral mythology and the violence underneath. The influence on his work is visible in stories about rural horror and families operating outside social norms. Number 1. The Haunting, 1963.
Stop it!
Did you hear me calling?
This house.
Robert Wise directed this one for Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, based on Shirley Jackson's novel, The Haunting of Hill House, with a budget of approximately $1.5 million, and delivered what Stephen King has called, repeatedly and without qualification, the scariest movie ever made. The film follows 4 people who spend several nights in Hill House, a New England mansion with a history of death and madness, as part of a paranormal investigation. Nothing is shown explicitly. No ghosts appear on screen, no gore is depicted. And yet the film generates terror so sustained and so psychologically precise that King has said he cannot watch it alone, even decades after first encountering it. Julie Harris plays Eleanor Vance, a deeply lonely woman with psychic sensitivity who becomes the house's primary target. Claire Bloom plays Theodora, a sophisticated bohemian who serves as Eleanor's foil. Richard Johnson plays Dr. Markway, the investigator who has brought them to Hill House. Russ Tamblyn plays Luke, the skeptical heir to the property. The four of them spend nights in the house, and gradually the house begins asserting itself, not through visible manifestations, but through sounds, through cold spots, through doors that breathe, and walls that pulse. What makes the haunting genuinely terrifying is Wise's understanding that suggestion is infinitely more powerful than depiction, that the sounds of something moving in darkness are more frightening than seeing what is making those sounds. The famous sequence in which Eleanor and Theodora lie in bed holding hands while something pounds on their door, the wood visibly bending inward, is one of the most frightening scenes ever filmed, despite showing nothing except reaction and implication. The sound design, which Wise and his team labored over obsessively, creates an auditory landscape of the house, breathing and settling and moving in ways that houses should not move. King has written about the haunting extensively in Danse Macabre and in numerous interviews, always returning to it as the template for how to construct horror through atmosphere. The film influenced his novel, The Shining, directly and substantially. The Overlook Hotel is a direct descendant of Hill House, a building with malevolent intelligence that targets the psychologically vulnerable. He has said that watching The Haunting taught him restraint, that what you do not show is more powerful than what you do show, and that horror rooted in psychological vulnerability, rather than an external threat, achieves something deeper and more lasting. This is the horror film that frightened Stephen King more than any other, and it did so without showing a single ghost. These 8 films represent decades of horror across multiple approaches, from gothic ghost stories to visceral exploitation to psychological paranoia. King has studied them, learned from them, and built his career in dialogue with them. They terrified him genuinely. According to the most successful horror writer in history, they are essential.